In this video, we're going to briefly examine the risk manager's role in estimating risk in the qualitative case study. So you have access to each of these reports I'm going to show you here. This is the main report for the GLIMRIS study, the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Interbasin study, and that was done for the aquatic nuisance species. I'm going to go to page 25 here because one of the things that we said that was very important was to identify problems and opportunities. That was one of our pieces of paper. And you can see that the GLIMRIS study made an effort to do this. They also have constraints here. So they are indeed using some of these techniques that we've talked about. I'm going to switch now to the risk assessment itself, and here we're going to look at page 14. And that was not the right page, so bear with me as I scroll down. Oh yes, it was. I just didn't go down far enough. So we've talked about the difference between the risk manager's goals and objectives, or objectives and constraints I should say. Here they are talking about risk assessment goals and objectives. If I was king of the world, everyone would use the language the way I would like it to be used. I'm not king of the world, and I'm not likely to become king of the world anytime soon. So everyone does this a little bit differently, but you can see they list their goals and objectives, and down here they specifically say, in support of this responsibility, this risk assessment is going to characterize and rank the aquatic nuisance species based on their likelihood of becoming established in a new basin, their potential for successfully undergoing interbasin transfer, and their potential for adversely impacting environmental, economic, and social resources and services. So we've talked about the three pieces of paper. To a great extent, this identifies some of the questions as well as some goals. But let me go down now and turn our attention to this notion of the risk manager's primary responsibility in terms of considering the results of the risk assessment. One of those is to understand the model. And here the model is a bit different than we had with our quantitative risk assessment. Up at the top here you see the familiar risk equation that we looked at in our first week in class. It says the risk equals the probability times the consequence, although they spell out in a little bit more detail, or perhaps in quite a bit more detail, what particular probability and what particular consequence they're interested in. This diagram here unpacks that equation. This is the risk assessment process that was used. First, they identified all the aquatic nuisance species in the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River basins. Then they excluded those that were already present in both basins because there's no risk of transfer if they're already there. And they excluded those that were unlikely to reach a new basin. So you might consider those steps actually part of what we've been describing as a risk profile, gathering this information. Those that passed through those two criteria, that's what was used to perform a risk assessment. On the left-hand side, you see the establishment assessment. That is essentially the probability piece of the risk. On the right-hand side, you see the consequence assessment. Notice that the establishment assessment is broken down into 5 specific events. This is the sequence of events that's necessary for the consequences to occur. The consequences are identified as environmental, economic, and social political. We're not going to go into the details right now. We will before we get through our program. But you can see that those 5 components of establishment become aggregated into a measure of the probability of establishment. The 3 measures of consequence get aggregated into an overall consequence. Those 2 pieces together are combined to identify a risk of adverse impacts for an individual aquatic nuisance species. Those risk results, in turn, are used to make judgments about the overall riskiness of a particular species and the overall riskiness of a particular pathway. Now, I would imagine that those of you who are new to this are listening and must feel quite confused. Don't be terribly concerned about that right now. I don't care whether you understand the details of what was done or not. That's not going to be our primary focus in your education. What I would like you to understand is that the risk managers for this particular study, they had to understand, at least at this level, they had to know what the model looked like. This is a qualitative model, so there is no estimation of numbers, and all of those elements underneath the establishment assessment, those 5 elements, and the 3 elements under the consequence assessment, for a total of 8 elements, were all rated as high, medium, low, or none, and those values were aggregated up into an overall risk assessment. And we're going to take a look at that right now. So here is yet another document, and we're going to go to page 31. Let me scroll on down. The poster child for the aquatic nuisance species was the Asian carp. There are several species of Asian carp, so we're going to look at the silver carp. And here you would see a risk assessment summary. When we looked at a risk characterization in our quantitative risk assessment, we saw numerical values, and this would be the equivalent for the qualitative. The native range and current distribution provides a bit of a life history for this species, along with the paragraph here and its ecology. Then there's a discussion of the evidence that was used as the basis for the qualitative judgments, and that's organized under the probability of establishment, and you'll see later under the consequence of establishment. But here is a risk assessment. This is the risk characterization, the risk assessment results for the silver carp, and this is bewildering. What we're looking at right now is just an assessment of the probability of establishment, only the probability of establishment. So if you look at the rows in the body of the table, they are the 5 elements that we were speaking about before. The columns, they are arranged first in terms of cause. That stands for Chicago Area Water System. And you may remember when we were looking at the map showing the shore of Lake Michigan, we found 5 different ways, 5 different pathways for species to get from the Mississippi River into Lake Michigan. These are those 5 different pathways. Let's just focus on cause 1, pathway number 1. Underneath that header, you see 4 other columns, T0, T10, T25, and T50. T0 is the present time. T10 is 10 years from now. T25, 25 years from now, and so on. Let's just look at T0. You will notice that the probability that the silver carp is on the pathway is rated as a high. The values in parentheses beneath it are assessments of the uncertainty about that qualitative rating. There is no uncertainty. Excuse me, I misspoke a bit, and I apologize for that. But I'll try to correct my error instead of beginning over. The pathway, this is the probability that a pathway exists, not that the silver carp is on the pathway, but that a pathway exists. There's a high probability with no uncertainty because you can see the water course. Boats go up and down it. It's clearly there. Arrival, that is the probability that the Asian carp has arrived at the pathway. That also is high. The probability that it can pass through is rated a low because of that electronic barrier in place. If it does get through, however, the probability that it would find conditions suitable for colonization in Lake Michigan are very high, are also high. And if it colonizes, the probability that it would spread would be high. The overall probability of establishment is a low because passage is a low. You'll learn that later when we get into our risk assessment courses. We'll come back, revisit this, and look at it with a different eye at that time. But you can see here that bottom row is the probability of establishment, and it goes from low in the near term to medium in the long term, because the longer you have that electronic barrier in place, the more likely it is that a problem will develop. Loss of field or power or some such thing. Let's scroll down a little bit here. These are consequences of establishment. You have environmental consequences, and you can see they are also rated based on the narrative data that you have there. So the consequences for the environment are high, the economics are high, and social political are high. So the total overall consequence would be high. This is a summary of the data, the evidence, and then we get to the risk of adverse impacts. So this carries over the probability of establishment and the consequence of establishment. So in this last column, these last four columns where we have the risk of adverse impacts, this is where the overall risk that silver carp pose is summarized. So you can see currently the risk of silver carp becoming established in Lake Michigan is low. In the next 10 years it would remain low, but after that the risk becomes greater. And so if you were to read through these reports, you would find that all the species that posed some sort of risk for establishment in a new watershed have been rated in this way. It would be the risk manager's responsibility to understand how these risk ratings were derived. That's all part of the risk manager's responsibility in considering the results of the risk assessment. The risk manager has to know the strengths and weaknesses of this, and that's going to be very important, as you'll see later in the course when we start looking at risk management alternatives. It's very important that the risk manager have at least this level of involvement with the risk assessment.